What if your fate could be sealed by a whisper, a dream, or a drop of blood no one was allowed to question? In ancient Mesopotamia, impurity was not always something you did. It was something declared about you. And once that word was spoken inside a sacred circle, there was no appeal, no witness, and no escape. The accusation rarely came in daylight. It emerged in murmurs between shamans, in private interpretations of omens, in dreams reported after ritual fasting. A young acolyte, often brought to the temple as a child, could spend years in service before suddenly being labeled impure, not by action but by interpretation. A fever during a lunar cycle, an unapproved vision, menstrual blood appearing at the wrong ritual moment, or even silence when speech was expected could be reframed as a sign of spiritual contamination. What made the accusation terrifying was its invisibility. There was no public charge, no formal ritual of judgment, no inscription carved in stone. The clan protected itself by erasing the process. To outsiders, the acolyte simply ceased to exist in communal life. Inside the cult, everyone knew what that disappearance meant. Mesopotamian spiritual systems were built on the belief that the divine world constantly intervened in the human body. Shamans and ritual leaders positioned themselves as the only interpreters capable of reading those interventions. That monopoly of interpretation gave them absolute power. If a woman's body was seen as a vessel of disorder, it was the shaman who named it, defined it, and punished it, all while claiming obedience to the gods. The term impure did not imply moral guilt in a modern sense. It meant dangerous, contagious, unstable. An impure acolyte was believed to threaten the balance between the clan and the divine forces protecting it, and once framed that way, any act against her could be justified as preservation rather than cruelty. What is most disturbing is how quickly the accusation isolated its target. Other women were forbidden to speak to her. Physical contact ended immediately. Her name might no longer be spoken aloud. This social death always came before whatever ritual punishment followed, ensuring that no empathy could interfere with obedience. This system did not need chains or guards. Fear did the work. Every acolyte knew that impurity could be declared without warning and without proof. The uncertainty was intentional. It trained submission, silence, and constant self-surveillance. The horror was not only what happened after the accusation, it was the knowledge that it could happen at any moment, to anyone. And once the word impure was spoken, the next step was never explained in advance. It was only hinted at, through absence, through locked chambers, through rituals conducted behind walls where sound did not escape. If this story unsettled you, that reaction is exactly why it needs to be told. These hidden rituals were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were systems of power, silence, and control that shaped entire societies. By understanding how impurity was used as a weapon, you begin to see how fear, belief, and authority can be manipulated to justify almost anything, especially violence against women. If this kind of hidden history matters to you, leave a comment and share what part shocked you the most. Click like so this story reaches more people who want the truth behind ancient religions, and subscribe to the channel if you want more raw, researched, and immersive explorations of what history tried to bury. In Mesopotamian spiritual thought, impurity was never a fixed condition. It was fluid, unstable, and dangerously subjective. What made it so powerful was precisely that no woman could ever be certain she was free from it. Impurity could be declared through signs no one else was allowed to interpret. A dream reported by a shaman, an omen read in animal entrails, a shadow crossing the wrong threshold, or a bodily function occurring at the incorrect cosmic moment. Blood was one of the most feared markers. Menstrual blood, childbirth blood, or unexplained bleeding placed a woman in a permanent state of suspicion. These biological realities were reframed as spiritual threats. The female body was treated as a porous boundary between worlds, capable of letting chaos enter the sacred order of the clan. This belief transformed natural processes into potential crimes. Dreams were even more dangerous. In Mesopotamian cosmology, dreams were considered messages from gods or demons. A female acolyte who dreamed incorrectly or whose dream was interpreted incorrectly by a shaman could be accused of harboring hostile forces. The woman's own testimony about her dream did not matter. Only the male interpreter's reading carried authority. A single sentence from him could redefine her spiritual status forever. Disobedience rarely needed to be explicit. Silence during a chant, Hesitation before a command or failure to show the correct emotional response during ritual could be reclassified as defiance. That defiance was never framed as personal resistance. It was labeled cosmic disorder. Once resistance became disorder, punishment became sacred duty. What kept this system functioning was ambiguity. There were no written laws clearly defining impurity for acolytes. The rules shifted depending on political needs inside the clan, rivalries among shamans, or moments of collective anxiety, such as drought, disease, or war. When fear increased, accusations multiplied. Women absorbed the consequences. Every 300 or so words, the narrative twisted in a subtle but devastating way. Impurity was not discovered. It was produced. It emerged at moments when authority needed reinforcement. Declaring a woman impure reminded everyone else that safety came from obedience, not innocence. This system also created competition among women. Fear of contamination discouraged solidarity. To avoid suspicion, acolytes monitored one another, reported irregularities, and distanced themselves from anyone showing signs of vulnerability. The structure ensured that isolation preceded punishment. The most chilling aspect is that impurity did not always lead to immediate violence. Sometimes it meant prolonged uncertainty, restricted movement, limited speech, forbidden touch. This slow erosion of identity broke resistance before any physical act occurred. By the time punishment arrived, the woman had already been symbolically erased. And yet, impurity was never fully resolved. Even after rituals of cleansing, suspicion lingered. Once marked, a woman remained fragile in the eyes of the clan, permanently closer to accusation than redemption. That instability was not a flaw in the system. It was its core design. Because the true power of impurity was not what it punished, but how it trained everyone else to live in fear of becoming the next target. Inside Mesopotamian religious life, power did not flow openly. It moved through layers of silence, hierarchy, and ritual secrecy. Shamans were not solitary mystics acting on intuition. They were members of tightly controlled sacred clans, bound by bloodlines, political alliances, and shared interest in maintaining authority. Within these circles, decisions about women were rarely spiritual alone. They were strategic. Acolytes never faced a single accuser. Their fate was usually determined by a small inner group: senior shamans, ritual priests, and clan elders who interpreted signs collectively behind closed doors. This process was never meant to be witnessed. The absence of transparency was not accidental. It protected the legitimacy of the decision. Once a verdict emerged, it was presented as divine inevitability, not human choice. What is crucial to understand is that these men held overlapping roles. A shaman could also be a healer, a political advisor, a genealogical authority, and a judge. This concentration of power meant that challenging one decision meant challenging the entire spiritual order. For women, resistance was unthinkable, not because they lacked awareness, but because the cost was total erasure. Rivalries within these sacred clans often played a hidden role. Accusations of impurity could be tools used to weaken another priest's influence by targeting women associated with him. An acolyte's body became a battlefield for male power struggles she could neither see nor escape. Her punishment served as a warning not to her alone, but to any faction threatening internal balance. Another narrative twist emerges when we examine age and lineage. Young acolytes without strong family protection were the most vulnerable. Widows, orphans, and women brought from distant regions had no social anchor. Their isolation made them ideal targets. In contrast, women connected to influential families were more likely to be quietly relocated, reassigned, or symbolically cleansed rather than destroyed outright. Justice, when it existed, followed status. These decisions were reinforced through ritual language designed to remove emotion. Women were referred to as vessels, thresholds, or carriers of imbalance. Dehumanization was essential. Once a woman ceased to be seen as an individual, her suffering could be framed as necessary correction rather than violence. Every few moments, the story deepens. The gods were not always the source of punishment. They were the justification. Shamans claimed divine instruction, but the timing of accusations often aligned perfectly with moments of social stress. Crop failure, disease, or unrest demanded a visible act of control. Declaring a woman impure reassured the community that chaos had a cause and a solution. What remains most unsettling is how normal this process became. There was no outrage, no rebellion, no recorded protest. The system trained acceptance. Women learned that survival depended on invisibility, compliance, and silence. Men learned that authority depended on fear presented as sacred order. Purification rituals in Mesopotamian cults were presented as acts of mercy, correction, and spiritual balance. In reality, they functioned as instruments of domination designed to break the acolyte long before any physical punishment reached its peak. Once a woman was declared impure, purification was not meant to restore her status. It was meant to demonstrate what happened to those who crossed invisible lines. These rituals rarely followed a fixed script. Their power came from unpredictability. An acolyte might be summoned at night, stripped of ritual garments, and led through corridors she had never been allowed to enter. Darkness itself was part of the ceremony. Disorientation weakened resistance. Silence heightened fear. Every step reinforced the idea that she no longer belonged to the visible world. Pain was often subtle at first. Extended fasting, enforced immobility, exposure to cold water, abrasive substances rubbed onto the skin, or prolonged kneeling on stone floors. None of these acts were framed as punishment. They were called cleansing. But their true purpose was to exhaust the body and soften the mind, making the acolyte receptive to suggestion, confession, and submission. Humiliation played an equally important role. The woman might be required to repeat declarations of impurity aloud, confess imagined spiritual faults, or endure ritual gestures that inverted her previous status. A priestess once respected could be forced to serve silently, avoid eye contact, or remain physically lowered in the presence of male ritual leaders. Identity was dismantled piece by piece. Every 300 to 400 words, the reality becomes more disturbing. Purification rituals were often observed by select members of the clergy, not to help the woman, but to reinforce hierarchy. Witnessing her degradation served as instruction. It reminded others of the consequences of deviation and reinforced loyalty through fear rather than faith. The most damaging aspect was psychological. These rituals blurred the line between guilt and innocence. Over time, many women began to internalize the accusation. If the gods demanded suffering, then perhaps suffering was deserved. This internal collapse was the true objective. A broken acolyte required no chains. What makes these rituals especially dangerous is that they left little physical evidence. Bruises faded, hunger ended, cold passed, but the behavioral changes remained. Women emerged quieter, hesitant, hyper-aware of every movement and word. The cult did not need to punish them again. They became self-regulating. And for those who resisted internally, who failed to show sufficient remorse or obedience, purification was only the beginning. The ritual was a threshold, not a conclusion. Beyond it waited spaces, procedures, and decisions never explained in advance, spoken only in fragments and gestures. If this pattern sounds familiar, it is because it was designed to be reusable. The ritual could be adapted, repeated, and escalated as needed, ensuring long-term control without public violence. Once purification rituals failed to produce complete submission, Mesopotamian cults shifted focus from correction to transformation. The woman's body itself became the site where authority was inscribed. Punishment no longer aimed to cleanse impurity, it aimed to rewrite identity. The acolyte was no longer treated as someone who could return to her former role, but as a warning made flesh. Physical marking was one of the most effective tools. Not all marks were permanent or visible to outsiders. Some were strategic: shaved hair, altered clothing, symbolic scars placed where only other initiates would see them. These signs functioned as silent labels. They announced contamination without words, ensuring that the woman carried her accusation wherever she went. Even when no blood was drawn, the message was clear. Her body no longer belonged to her. Isolation intensified this process. Women marked as impure were often removed from communal sleeping quarters, denied participation in daily rituals, and excluded from shared meals. Isolation was never explained as punishment. It was framed as protection for others. This reversal was crucial. The acolyte was made responsible for the harm her presence supposedly caused, deepening guilt and compliance. Every few hundred words, the story reveals another layer. Silence was enforced not only externally, but internally. Speaking without permission, asking questions, or showing emotional distress could be interpreted as further signs of disorder. Over time, women learned to regulate their own expressions. Fear shaped posture, movement, even breathing. Control no longer required constant supervision. Some punishments targeted sensory experience, limited light, Repetitive chants, prolonged stillness, or deprivation of familiar sounds were used to destabilize perception. These methods blurred the boundary between ritual and psychological conditioning. Disorientation made memory unreliable. Confusion weakened resistance. The woman's sense of time, self, and agency slowly dissolved. What is rarely acknowledged is how these practices destroyed social bonds. Other acolytes were instructed to avoid contact, not out of cruelty, but survival. Association with an impure woman risked contamination. The system ensured that isolation felt natural, even necessary. Solidarity became dangerous. The most disturbing transformation occurred when obedience became automatic. A woman no longer needed to be watched closely. Her body carried the discipline. She moved carefully, spoke minimally, anticipated punishment before it arrived. This internalization of control was the ultimate success of the system. And yet, these punishments were not endpoints. They were filters. Women who endured them without breaking were sometimes retained as silent labor, shadows within the temple. Others were removed entirely, passed along to processes never described openly, only hinted at through absence and sealed spaces. Beyond the public halls and ritual courtyards of Mesopotamian temples existed spaces that were never described in hymns, inventories, or official records. These were chambers known only to senior shamans and select priests, places whose purpose was implied through silence rather than explanation. When an acolyte crossed a certain threshold of accusation, purification and punishment ended. Disappearance began. The transition was deliberate. A woman was not told where she was going. She was summoned quietly, often during ritual hours when attention was fixed elsewhere. No procession, no announcement. Her absence would only be noticed later, and by then, questions were already discouraged. In a system trained to equate curiosity with danger, silence followed naturally. These chambers were framed as sacred interiors, spaces too holy for the uninitiated. That framing mattered. It meant no one was allowed to ask what occurred inside. Whatever happened there was automatically divine. The lack of witnesses was not a flaw in the ritual, it was its foundation. Without witnesses, there could be no memory. Without memory, there could be no challenge. Every few hundred words, the narrative tightens. Disappearance was not always immediate death. Some women were held in prolonged confinement, separated from natural light, stripped of temporal markers. Days blurred into rituals without context. The goal was dissolution. Identity required continuity, and continuity was systematically destroyed. In some cases, women emerged changed beyond recognition. Silent, obedient, physically weakened, reassigned to labor roles that required no speech and little visibility. In other cases, they never returned. Their names were removed from daily invocations, their possessions redistributed. Their existence ended not with execution, but with administrative erasure. What made these chambers so effective was plausibility. The community was conditioned to believe that sacred spaces demanded sacrifice. If a woman disappeared, it was easier to assume divine necessity than human cruelty. This cognitive shortcut protected the system. Faith filled the gaps left by absence. Another disturbing twist emerges when we consider repetition. These chambers were not used once or twice. They were part of an established process. The architecture itself suggests routine. Controlled access points, limited sound transmission, proximity to ritual areas without visibility. Violence was not accidental. It was designed into the structure. Fear spread outward from these disappearances. Every acolyte knew that certain doors, once passed, did not open outward again. No explanation was required. The absence itself was instructional. It taught obedience more effectively than public punishment ever could. And yet, even this stage was not the final mechanism of control. The true power of disappearance was how it shaped those who remained, how it taught women to measure every word, movement, and thought against the possibility of becoming the next absence. The punishment of one woman was never meant to end with her. In Mesopotamian cults, discipline worked only when it spread. Every act of ritual violence, every disappearance, every whispered accusation was designed to be witnessed indirectly, absorbed emotionally, and internalized collectively. Fear was not a side effect of the system. It was the system. What made fear so effective was its ambiguity. Acolytes were rarely told exactly what had happened to the woman who vanished. They were given fragments instead: a sealed door, a reassigned sleeping space, a name no longer spoken during invocations. The imagination filled the gaps with something worse than certainty: This uncertainty forced constant vigilance. If the rules were unclear, obedience had to be absolute. Shamans understood this psychology well. They allowed rumors to circulate without confirmation. One woman was said to have angered a god through improper thoughts. Another supposedly carried spiritual contamination in her bloodline. None of it was verified, and none of it needed to be. The purpose was not truth. It was compliance. Each story reinforced the idea that impurity could arise from anywhere, at any time. Fear also reorganized relationships between women. Compassion became dangerous. Friendship implied risk. Speaking in defense of someone accused meant drawing attention to oneself. Slowly, isolation replaced solidarity. The cult no longer needed to separate women physically. Fear did it for them. Acolytes learned to distance themselves emotionally before distance was enforced. Every 300 to 400 words, the pattern becomes clearer. Punishment was pedagogical. It taught by example. A single act of ritual violence could regulate behavior for years. Younger acolytes adjusted their posture, speech, and expressions after witnessing the consequences suffered by others. Fear shaped ritual precision more effectively than devotion ever could. Even silence was monitored. Too much curiosity suggested defiance. Too little emotion suggested spiritual emptiness. Women were forced into an impossible balance, constantly measuring themselves against invisible expectations. Anxiety became permanent. That anxiety made control effortless. What is especially disturbing is how fear was reframed as spiritual care. Shamans claimed that terror purified the soul, that suffering strengthened devotion, that obedience protected the community. By moralizing fear, they stripped it of its cruelty and transformed it into duty. Over time, this system produced women who enforced the rules themselves. Senior acolytes corrected younger ones. Warnings were passed quietly. Boundaries were policed internally. The cult no longer needed constant punishment. Fear had been successfully transferred. And once fear became sacred, questioning it meant questioning the gods themselves, a risk no woman could afford to take. What we know about these practices survives not because they were recorded honestly, but because erasure is never perfect. Mesopotamian systems of control depended on silence, yet fragments slipped through the cracks of administration and ritual routine. Clay tablets cataloging supplies, lists of temple personnel, sudden gaps in names, altered. Duties and unexplained reallocations form a negative image, a record of absence rather than confession. In some inventories, a woman's name appears for years and then stops abruptly, replaced by a generic title or omitted entirely. There is no note of death, no transfer, no ritual completion, just disappearance. In other cases, tablets mention offerings for purification, without specifying recipients, followed by unusual quantities of restraints, oils, or isolation rations. These are not dramatic narratives. They are logistical traces, and that is precisely why they matter. Bureaucracy tells the truth when ideology refuses to. Fragmented inscriptions add another layer. Broken lines refer to sealed rooms, restricted interiors, or rites not for public recitation. The language is careful, evasive, and formulaic. It avoids verbs of violence, favoring abstractions like balance, correction, or appeasement. But when read alongside sudden personnel changes or shifts in ritual schedules, a pattern emerges. Moments of spiritual crisis followed by quiet removal of women from visibility. Every few hundred words, the picture sharpens. Letters between officials sometimes allude to disorder among the attendants or necessary containment. The phrasing is deliberately vague. Yet the timing aligns with periods of drought, epidemic, or political instability. These documents suggest that punishment escalated when authority felt threatened, not when impurity increased. The women became instruments for restoring confidence, not morality. Even myths and hymns contribute indirectly. Certain texts warn against female figures who cross thresholds, speak unauthorized truths, or attract divine attention. These stories functioned as cultural reinforcement, teaching audiences what happened to women who disrupted sacred order. Myth normalized what ritual enacted. Together they formed a closed loop of justification. The most unsettling evidence is what is missing. There are no testimonies from the women themselves, no first-person accounts. That absence is not accidental. It is the final success of the system. When only administrators, priests, and scribes leave records, Violence becomes invisible by design. Reading these sources requires discipline. The truth does not announce itself. It appears in inconsistencies, omissions, and sudden silences. History speaks here not through what is said, but through what had to be removed to preserve authority. And once you learn to read absence as evidence, the next realization becomes unavoidable. These patterns are not unique to one temple or one city. They repeat with minor variations wherever sacred power and female vulnerability intersect. Once you step back from individual temples and isolated incidents, a disturbing clarity emerges. These practices were not anomalies. They followed a pattern that reappeared across different Mesopotamian cities, cults, and time periods. Names of gods changed. Ritual. Language shifted. Architectural styles evolved. But the mechanisms of control directed at women remained strikingly consistent. At the center of this pattern was the strategic use of ambiguity. Impurity was never clearly defined because clarity limits power. Whether in Sumerian, Akkadian, or later Assyrian contexts, the accusation always relied on signs that only male authorities could interpret. Dreams, bodily states, omens, or deviations in ritual behavior functioned as flexible triggers. This allowed leaders to activate punishment whenever social order felt threatened. Another recurring element was the privatization of violence. Across centuries, punishment moved away from public spectacle and into sealed interiors. Public executions create martyrs. Hidden removals create obedience. The same logic appears repeatedly. Isolate the woman, erase her socially, then act beyond communal sight. The absence becomes instructional. Fear spreads without visible bloodshed. Every 300 to 400 words, the repetition becomes more chilling. Female spiritual authority was consistently reframed as instability. Prophetesses, ritual singers, healers, and dream interpreters were tolerated only as long as they remained controllable. When their influence grew too strong, impurity accusations followed. This pattern reveals that repression was reactive. Women were punished not for weakness, but for perceived power. Political stress intensified these cycles. Periods of famine, war, or dynastic transition coincide with spikes in ritual discipline. In those moments, controlling women's bodies and voices reassured the community that order was being restored. Violence became symbolic governance. The gods were invoked not because they demanded blood, but because authority required a sacred justification. Another repeated strategy was the fragmentation of responsibility. No single priest decided a woman's fate. Decisions were distributed across councils, rituals, and divine interpretations. This diffusion ensured that no one could be held accountable. The system punished without a visible executioner. Guilt dissolved into procedure. What is most unsettling is how these patterns normalized themselves over generations. Young acolytes entered temples already trained by stories, absences, and warnings inherited from the past. Fear became tradition. Control became ritual. Abuse became invisible because it was expected. And once a pattern survives long enough, it no longer needs to be enforced aggressively. It becomes self-sustaining. Women regulate themselves. Communities justify silence. The structure persists even when individual actors change. This repetition across time reveals the truth most histories avoid. These acts were not failures of religion. They were successful strategies of power. And understanding that pattern forces a final confrontation with what these systems ultimately produced. Not devotion, but disciplined fear embedded deep within society. The final and most enduring consequence of these practices was not physical punishment or disappearance. It was psychological inheritance. Long after the rituals ended, long after individual shamans died, the fear they engineered continued to live inside the social fabric of Mesopotamian communities. Violence against women did not need to be repeated constantly, because its memory had already been embedded into behavior. This legacy began in childhood. Girls raised near temples absorbed the rules long before they understood them. They learned which spaces were forbidden, which questions were dangerous, which bodily signs required silence. Fear was not taught openly. It was modeled through absence, hesitation, and whispered warnings. A missing name, a closed door, a sudden change in ritual roles. These signals shaped perception more effectively than instruction. Every few hundred words, the impact deepens. Women internalized surveillance. They monitored their own bodies, dreams, emotions, and thoughts, anticipating judgment before it arrived. Self-censorship replaced external control. The most effective systems of domination are the ones that convince their targets to police themselves. This psychological conditioning also altered spiritual experience itself. Devotion became anxious rather than transcendent. Ritual participation was driven by avoidance, not connection. Women learned to associate the sacred with risk. Faith was no longer a source of meaning, but a landscape filled with invisible traps. This distortion of spirituality ensured obedience while hollowing belief. Generational transmission made this fear resilient. Mothers warned daughters. Senior acolytes corrected juniors. Stories circulated without details, preserving terror without context. The original violence no longer needed to occur. Its shadow was enough. Over time, the source of fear became abstract, untouchable, and therefore impossible to confront. Another unsettling realization emerges here. This legacy did not remain confined to temples. It shaped broader social expectations. Female silence became virtue. Obedience became morality. Spiritual authority became male by default. What began as ritual control evolved into cultural norm, reinforcing itself across households, clans, and cities. This is why these practices matter far beyond their historical moment. They reveal how power uses spirituality not only to punish, but to program. Once fear is framed as sacred, it becomes immune to challenge. Questioning it feels dangerous, even generations later. And yet, understanding this mechanism breaks part of its spell. When we identify how fear was constructed, transmitted, and normalized, we expose it as human strategy rather than divine command. That recognition does not undo the past, but it restores agency to the present. If you stayed with this story until the end, you've confronted a side of ancient history most narratives avoid. Not myths of glory, but systems of fear built on silence, ritual, and control. These stories only remain hidden when they are ignored. Subscribe to the channel if you want more immersive, researched, and unfiltered explorations of what ancient religions and power structures tried to erase. Leave a like so this kind of history reaches people who are ready to face uncomfortable truths. And in the comments, write, "They were silenced," to show you made it to the end and understand why these voices matter. Now, watch the next video appearing on your screen, because this pattern didn't end in Mesopotamia, and what comes next reveals how the same mechanisms resurfaced in another civilization.